Welcome to today's talk. My name is Joseph Giacomin. Today I'll be discussing anthropomorphism, more specifically anthropomorphism in design. In recent years, this topic has become more and more important and more relevant to designers because the machines and artifacts and products and systems and services we're designing are getting more complex, more sophisticated. They're having more functions. They're being given more agency and more decisions to make. So whether people respond to it in an anthropomorphic manner or a less anthropomorphic manner is becoming an important design consideration. Something keeps me busy with my research on a weekly basis. So let's discuss anthropomorphism. So what is anthropomorphism? Anthropomorphism is a natural human tendency, partially hardwired in the cortex, partially what we learn from when we're a child. So there's both nature and nurture involved in creating, stimulating this reaction from people. It's the natural human tendency to treat inanimate objects as if they were living creatures. So you will see people getting mad at their computer screen and banging it. You will see people treating their cars better than their girlfriends. You will see all kinds of behaviors from human beings where they seem, at least for periods of time, to be interacting with machines, inanimate objects, in a human-like manner, despite the fact they know very well that it is a machine. So it's important, and the characteristics we as designers choose for our artifacts will affect how strongly this tendency is stimulated, and that affects the way people interpret the actions of the artifact, the agency of the artifact, and the trust people develop in the artifact. And an important first point to note is that the cognitive cues needed to stimulate the human anthropomorphizing tendency don't have to be that many or that numerous, that detailed in nature. This study from a few years ago for the head of a robot, looking at how people responded, how anthropomorphically they judged the prototype head of a robot, you can see that you can stimulate the human anthropomorphizing tendency quite strongly by mimesis, by copying and making it look like a real living creature, a real human in this case. But if you look at the other bottom corner of the triangle, you'll notice that even iconic cues, just putting a few key details in a few key positions, iconically simplifying the human form, is more than sufficient to stimulate more or less the same degree of anthropomorphic response. And surprisingly, it's also possible to stimulate human anthropomorphic responses even with very small amounts of detail. The abstract representations at the top of this diagram suggest that even a couple circles looking as if they're in the right place to be an eye and some object in the right place to be a nose and so forth is more than sufficient to stimulate an anthropomorphic judgment or response in the test participants in this study. So anthropomorphism is not necessarily about making something look like a dog or a cat, a bird or a human. It's about a couple of key cognitive cues. So what kind of cues are we talking about? The first fundamental cue that perhaps you're familiar with, it's quite commonly discussed in many circles, is that of shape. The form and shape and aesthetic that we give to our artifact strongly affects the human anthropomorphizing tendency. This study that's shown on this slide is one of many studies from the automotive industry, because over the years the industry has looked at how people respond to the styling and shapes and the functions that they provide on the vehicles. And over and over and over again in dozens and dozens of studies, it's been shown that people tend to judge the vehicle as if it was a person. In this case, the front of the vehicle has a set of eyes of sorts, a nose of sorts, a mouth of sorts, as most road vehicles do at the front and back. Many buildings have symmetrical window layouts around the central doorway. Many artifacts designed by human beings will have, either intentionally or unintentionally, anthropomorphic shapes to them. In this study, it was looked at the sense of dominance or aggressiveness that the people judged the vehicle to have. And the vehicles were judged in the same way, using the same parameters as have bbeen found in psychological investigations on numerous occasions for human beings. So the front face of the vehicle, if it has the same characteristics of a human being to stimulate dominance, the vehicle is judged as dominant. If it's got the characteristics which in a human face would have been considered less aggressive or less dominant, the vehicle itself will be judged in the same manner. So the shape and the form, and to some degree the aesthetics, is incredibly important in stimulating the human anthropomorphizing tendency. Even more important than the shape, however, is movement. All living creatures move. They move either for physiological reasons or for sensory reasons, to scan around them and look at what's happening in the environment around them. So moving or not moving is one of the scientific criteria to decide whether something's alive or not. If something has no ability to move, it's not considered a living creature. Well, this characteristic of motion is in our nervous system, partially hardwired in the sensory circuitry, partially in the cognitive cortex, something we learn from when we're a child. There's both nature and nurture involved. We tend to think of things that move as if they were living creatures. And the exact timing and sequence of the motions, whether it's a rotation or a translation, how big is the sweep, how quickly it moves, the speed of the device, these parameters, which we as designers have to specify for the machines, the artifacts, the devices we're making, these parameters will push the psychological interpretation more in the direction of some animal or some human being more than others. So we shape the anthropomorphic response by how we choose these motion parameters for our artifacts, whether it's a motion on a screen, or a motion of a component, or a motion of the complete machine. Even more important than motion and shape is voice. It's been shown over and over, demonstrated over and over in numerous studies over the years that the human voice strongly stimulates the human anthropomorphizing tendency in people. So if our Siri, if our Cortana, if our navigator, if our digital assistant of whatever type it is, makes sounds in the same frequency and amplitude intervals as human beings, it will already start to stimulate a human anthropomorphic response. If it then talks and speaks a language that we recognize and we interpret, well, then the human anthropomorphizing tendency is strongly, strongly stimulated. This study that's on this slide is just one of the many, many studies and the many books dedicated to this topic. In this study, it was demonstrated quite clearly that for the exact same communication, the exact same words, if it appears as a text message on a screen of the digital device or the television, it does not stimulate the human anthropomorphizing tendency nearly as much as if we heard it spoken, which is the reason so many digital assistants these days will perform some of their duties through the voice channel rather than simply text-based interactions with the users, because human voice quickly pushes us down this direction psychologically, and it leads to us interacting with the machine more as if it were a living creature. And in many cases, in many design settings, that's beneficial towards simplifying the interaction and making it less error prone and more effective and efficient. And it's not just the physical characteristics, such as the voice and the movement, the shape. It can also be something as simple as the name. All we have to do is give it a human name, and we're already, to some degree, stimulating the human anthropomorphizing tendency. In the example shown on this slide, a company which was developing a medicine delivery robot, which could shuttle medicines and medical equipment from one location to another in a hospital setting, they introduced the machines with human names, calling it by human names in some wards and in some hospitals, and they introduced it with more machine-like names based on numbers or scientific technical terms in other wards or other hospitals. And from the activities and the ethnography became very evident very quickly that the exact same machine, when it was called by a human name, was proving to be more accepted, more trusted. People were less critical of malfunctions and errors and mistakes made by the machine than those other machines, the exact same type, which were introduced with more scientific, numerical, and mechanical-like names. So just the name they give to the exact same designed artifact was stimulating, due to the human innate anthropomorphizing tendency, very different responses and very different interactions with the users and major stakeholders in more or less the same settings. So name is a very simple, very basic tool, but that alone is already sufficient to move the anthropomorphizing tendency forward in a direction. And it should be noted that with the stimulation of the human anthropomorphizing tendency comes with it a large number of associations and connotations and interpretations which are historically or traditionally associated with that anthropomorphic response. Specifically, for example, as shown on this slide, more contoured body shapes, which would tend to remind us more of a female human form, will tend to be interpreted as more appropriate robots or machines for roles and activities and jobs which have traditionally, historically, been performed by females in our society. And robots or machines with more angular, more squared forms to their shape will tend to bring with that anthropomorphizing tendency an expectation or an opinion that they're more appropriate for jobs and roles and activities which have historically, traditionally been performed by males. So rightly or wrongly, at the current point in time in our society, there's quite a large amount of gendering occurring. So once the anthropomorphizing tendency is stimulated to some degree, there comes with it a set of thoughts, considerations, criteria, expectations, stereotypes, which affect the interactions with the users and the other major stakeholders. And finally, it needs to be noted that something that's been demonstrated over and over again over the last 20, 30 years in many, many research studies and in many actual design settings in real life applications, there's this concept of uncanny valley. Over and over again, it's been demonstrated that a small number of cognitive cues which stimulate the human anthropomorphizing tendency tends to prove beneficial in terms of people's reactions, people's interactions, their empathy, their emotional responses to the artifacts. So giving cars a front and a rear that looks a little bit like a face has usually proven beneficial. And the more cognitive cues and the more stimulation of the human anthropomorphizing tendency, the better, the higher, the more positive usually is, on average, the emotional response. However, with the increased sophistication of today's modern technologies and systems, and robots in particular, there does come a point at which adding more cognitive cues, not just the shape and the motion, but the voice and some other things, if we get to the point that there's many, many of these cues, quite a few pushing in the direction of it being, let's say, a human or a cat or a dog or a horse or some other creature, and then there are some characteristics which inevitably are not in tune and synced with this interpretation, we hit what's referred to as the uncanny valley. It happens very obviously with human anthropomorphic robots. If we make a robot that looks a little bit like a human being and talks a little bit like a human being, it usually gets a pretty good response from people. People are happy to be around it, happy to work with it and to use it in their workplace setting. However, when the robot starts to be eerily similar to a human being, the responses turn rapidly negative, people are not comfortable around it, and the confusion of whether it is a human or not a human becomes something psychologically unpleasant. And this uncanny valley will last until the anthropomorphic robot, for example, is brought to be so realistic that it's no longer possible to distinguish between the robot and a real human being. So there is this general benefit. It usually is beneficial in design settings to add a small number of cognitive cues which are stimulating the anthropomorphizing tendency, but you can overdo it, and there can be a point at which it becomes negative because it's too many for the nature, the role, and the specific activities which this particular artifact is designed to perform. So thank you very much for your time and patience. I hope that some of the points discussed in this short talk are beneficial. Hopefully they stimulate a few considerations which might be a benefit to your everyday work. And thank you, and I look forward to speaking with you again on the next occasion. Thank you.